Have you ever imagined what it would be like to discover that the person you trusted most, with whom you built dreams and shared your entire life, could betray not only your heart, but also your faith? My name is Linda Parker. I'm 55 years old, and today I'm going to share with you the most painful and transformative story I've ever experienced. Perhaps as you hear each word, you'll recognize yourself in some moments. Or perhaps you'll discover truths you never had the courage to face. I've always believed in the power of faith, in marriage blessed by God, and in the promise that love would be enough to endure any hardship. I grew up in the church, serving, participating in ministries, believing that my home would be a reflection of Christ's presence. But life has cruel ways of surprising us. What I believed to be a solid marriage actually hid silences, distances, and invisible cracks. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt something was wrong but didn't want to believe it? Betrayal doesn't come with warning. It creeps in through the cracks of silence, through repeated apologies, through nights when coldness occupies the space where once there was affection. When the truth finally came out, I didn't just lose a husband. I lost my sense of security, my trust, and I nearly let my faith shatter along with my heart. What you're about to discover now may surprise you, because the pain wasn't just from abandonment, but also from judgment, from the accusatory looks, and from the silence they tried to impose on my voice. Stay with me until the end, because this isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a profound account of how abandonment and judgment can nearly destroy a woman, while simultaneously revealing a strength she herself didn't even know existed. I'll take you through my journey, from the moment everything fell apart to the moments when, even though I was powerless, I decided not to give up. And what happened next is something you need to hear. I always believed my faith was unshakable, until the day betrayal nearly made me give up everything. For many years, I told myself that nothing could shake the foundation of my marriage. After all, it had been built with prayer, dedication, and so many promises before God. I believed that trust was like a wall, and that nothing external could tear it down. But the hidden truth is that often what destroys comes not from without, but from within, silently, hidden behind the scenes of routine. Betrayal doesn't begin with a stolen kiss or a secret rendezvous. It arises in small choices, in cold decisions, in distance disguised as weariness. I clearly remember the first changes. He'd come home late, avoid long conversations, and suddenly the cell phone became off limits. I tried to justify it in my mind, saying it was just the weight of work, that the phase would pass. But inside, something was already screaming, something warning me that a shadow was approaching. This impact wasn't immediate. It was like a slow poison running through the veins of our life together. And when the truth finally revealed itself to me, it wasn't just my heart that broke. It was as if a part of my very identity had been ripped away. The pain of betrayal is unlike any other. It's not limited to one act. It carries the feeling of not having been enough, of having been deceived for years, of seeing everything you've built questioned. And the cruelest part is that when you expect support, you often encounter judgment. People only see the surface, but they don't know the secret journey you live inside. And I, who had always been seen as a woman of faith and family, found myself questioned, criticized, even silenced. It was as if my voice had lost its right to exist. This phase took me to a place I never thought I'd be. I'd look at my Bible and couldn't open it. The words seemed distant, the prayers empty. I wondered if all my effort, all my nights on my knees, had been in vain. It was a crisis not only of my marriage, but of my spirituality, my mindset, of everything I believed to be firm and eternal. I felt like someone walking in the dark, without a map, without direction, just trying to survive the weight of a revelation that had transformed my entire life. And it was in this silence, in this profound pain, that I realized something even greater was happening. It wasn't just a story of marital betrayal. It was a story of transformation, of how pain can lead us to questions we never dared ask, decisions we didn't want to make, and an unexpected journey in search of meaning. Let's explore the deeper side of this question together, because it was in this place, between fragility and hope, that I found answers that changed everything. I grew up in a Christian family, surrounded by songs, prayers, and the certainty that faith was the greatest foundation anyone could have. From a young age, I learned that serving in the church was not only a privilege, but also a life mission. I attended every service, every event, every activity, always believing that this environment was a safe place, protected from the failures and pains the outside world faced. When I met the man who would become my husband, my mind was filled with dreams and convictions. I saw him as an answer to prayer, as someone sent by God to walk beside me. The promises made before the altar, accompanied by tears and vows of eternal fidelity, were engraved in my heart as an absolute certainty. I believed that my home was being built on the most solid rock that could exist. At first, everything seemed to confirm this expectation. Our first years were filled with enthusiasm, plans, and a shared faith. We went to church together, sang together, and I felt proud to live a marriage that, in the eyes of others, seemed exemplary. Behind the scenes, however, there were already small signs that I chose to ignore. The excessive workload, the absences disguised as commitments, the coldness in some conversations. The mentality I carried led me to believe that everything was just a passing phase, that every couple faces difficulties, and that patience and prayer were all it took for everything to work out. But the hidden truth is that our prayers aren't always answered the way we imagine. The impact of the decisions he made in silence began to erode the foundations of our relationship, and I, caught up in activities and responsibilities, didn't realize how far I was drifting from myself. I was seen as the devoted wife, the faithful servant, the woman who supported her family through prayer. Behind this portrait lay sleepless nights, doubts I stifled, tears I kept hidden. I didn't want to admit, even to myself, that something was already breaking within our home. This journey made me understand that we often live more concerned with keeping up appearances than with facing the fissures that slowly grow silently. It's easier to believe that everything is fine than to confront the pain that's already seeping in. I believed I was in control, that all I had to do was hold on. But the reality is that control has always been far beyond my control. This realization led me to a point of profound reflection. To what extent was the faith I carried truly unshakable, and to what extent was it being shaped by the expectations of others? The marriage I believed was built on rock was proving as fragile as sand in the face of the first storms. And yet, I clung to the image that our story was solid. The transformation that was coming wouldn't just be in the relationship, but also in how I saw my own identity, my faith, and the true meaning of standing firm in the face of adversity. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely in this clash between ideal and reality that I began to discover the first cracks in what I once thought was indestructible. From the outside, everyone thought we had the perfect marriage. People saw us walking down the aisle together, smiling at social occasions, sharing hugs on birthdays and anniversaries. The image was flawless, almost as if it were a portrait carefully crafted to be admired. I heard compliments constantly. "You're an example of a Christian couple. What a blessing to see such a strong marriage." But the hidden truth is that those words, instead of filling me with joy, began to suffocate me, because I knew that, behind the appearance, there was a void growing within me. It was a silence that couldn't be explained in public, a separation that occurred behind the scenes of our daily lives. Small distances became chasms. He spent hours glued to his phone, justifying delays with work commitments, and I silently tried to convince myself it was just the hustle and bustle of modern life. But something was deeply troubling me, as if my heart knew there was more to it than met the eye. And this premonition grew stronger and stronger. The impact on me was devastating, but invisible to others. I smiled at family gatherings, fulfilled my responsibilities at church, but inside, I carried a weight that drained me. The mindset I had built over the years, that a good wife holds the home together, that prayer is enough to heal any wound, caused me to remain silent in the face of my own suspicions. I believed that questioning was a sign of weakness, and so I swallowed my doubts and continued playing the role of a happy woman. This contrast between what was shown and what was lived began to corrode my soul. I wondered how many other people also lived hiding their pain to protect an image. It was as if I were trapped in a play, where backstage was a scene of loneliness and tears, while on stage everything seemed perfect. This kind of duality has a profound impact because it forces us to live a life of facade, and the more time passes, the harder it becomes to face our own truth. The revelations came slowly, and each detail I uncovered heightened the feeling that I was living a carefully constructed lie. It's frightening to realize how someone can divide their life into two versions, the one they show the world and the one they hide in silence. And I, caught up in this plot, had to deal with the confusion of not knowing which version I truly fit into. It was like walking in quicksand. The more I tried to hold on, the deeper I sank into the void. This journey has taught me that what appears perfect isn't always truly perfect. Sometimes perfection is just a mask, created to hide deep cracks that no one dares to show. And it's at this point that the pain begins to intensify, because it's not just the betrayal that destroys, but also the realization that you've been deceived by the glitter of an illusion. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it's precisely at the intersection of appearance and reality that I discovered how much my life was about to change, irreversibly. It's strange how, even in the midst of pain, I still worried about maintaining that image of perfection everyone expected to see. It was as if I'd become a hostage to other people's expectations, trapped in a role that no longer made sense to me. And perhaps you, listening now, have also felt the need to hide your own flaws so as not to disappoint anyone. I know how much it weighs. Therefore, sharing my story here is not only a way to vent, but also a way to create a safe space for other women to recognize themselves and, who knows, find strength in the midst of their own struggles. And it's precisely because I believe in this purpose that I want to open my heart to you about something important. If this topic resonates with you, if my words have somehow touched your life, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, not because it's just another button to click, but because each new subscription is like a flame that keeps this message alive, allowing it to reach more women who today are crying in silence, feeling alone and invisible. Your participation. Here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content, creating a community of support and hope amidst so much hidden pain. Leave a comment below with what has touched you most so far, because your words not only encourage me to keep going, but also strengthen other women who read this and realize they are not alone on this journey. I believe that when we share our stories, we build bridges, and these bridges have the power to transform realities. And it is in this spirit of communion, learning, and sincere revelations that I continue to share my experience. Because despite all the emptiness I felt at home, something much greater was about to be revealed. He started spending more time at work, more time on his phone, less time with me. At first, it was just subtle excuses, long meetings, urgent deadlines, clients demanding attention after hours. I accepted it, trying to believe it was part of adulthood, that professional effort would bring us benefits in the future. But there was something different about the way he was absent. It wasn't just his body that wasn't present. It was his mind, his heart, his energy. Even when he was physically at home, he felt miles away. His gaze no longer sought me. Conversations became monosyllabic, and silent dinners began to become the rule, not the exception. My cell phone, previously forgotten on the table, was now kept in my pocket, protected by passwords, and even taken to the bathroom. These small actions, combined, created a feeling of estrangement and distrust within me. It was as if there was a hidden truth behind that screen that I couldn't access. I tried to push away negative thoughts, convincing myself it was just insecurity on my part. But deep down, I already knew that reality was changing. And this change had a direct impact on how I saw myself as a wife, as a woman, and even as a person of faith. It's painful to realize that the space once filled with complicity is now filled with silence. The journey we once walked side by side began to transform into two parallel paths that barely crossed. I wondered if it was something I'd done or failed to do, if I'd lost the ability to be interesting, to be a priority. These questions echoed in my mind every night, slowly but relentlessly undermining my self-esteem. Behind the scenes, I was no longer the same. I continued to appear in public with a smile on my face, maintaining the image of a devoted wife, but inside me, a whirlwind of doubts grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a gulf between us, and that gulf widened every time he turned his head to reply to a message, every time his attention was drawn anywhere but me. It's at this point that our mindset begins to shift. When answers don't come, our minds create their own explanations. I alternated between the fear that I was imagining things and the near certainty that I was living on the brink of a painful revelation. This tension, this invisible interplay between suspicion and denial, wears on the soul in a way few can understand. You feel like you're fighting something you can't name, and it consumes immense emotional energy. The curious thing is that, amidst this whole process, I still held on to the hope that it was just a phase, that time would correct what seemed out of place. Hope is treacherous because it keeps us trapped in an illusion, even when all signs point to a different reality. And I clung to this illusion with all my strength, as if admitting otherwise was the same as declaring the end of everything I had dreamed. This was the time I learned that signs should never be ignored. They are small revelations, glimpses of the truth that insists on revealing itself, even when we try to hide it. And even though I tried to hide it from myself, I already knew something was about to happen, something that would forever change not only my marriage, but also my outlook on life, faith, and love. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because every small detail that seemed insignificant was actually part of a much larger puzzle that was about to unfold before my eyes. One day, unintentionally, I saw messages that tore me apart. He was cheating on me. I remember it like it was yesterday. The screen lit up in the dark of the room, the flashing notification, my heart racing, my mind begging me not to look, but my eyes obeying instinct. A few sentences were enough to dismantle everything I believed to be solid. Simple words, but charged with an intimacy that no longer existed between us. They weren't just messages. They were revelations of a parallel life, of a backstage I had never imagined. It was as if I had entered, uninvited, a universe where I had no place. In that instant, time seemed to freeze. The ground disappeared beneath my feet, and the air grew heavy, almost impossible to breathe. I didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying the stark truth before me. It was confirmation of all. The suspicions I'd tried to suppress, all the signs I'd chosen to ignore. And yet, when reality hit me, I felt a pain so intense it seemed unbearable. It's difficult to describe the impact of such a discovery. It's not just my heart that bleeds. It's my identity, my trust, my faith that trembles. What struck me most was not just the betrayal itself, but the stark contrast between the public life he displayed with me and the secret life he revealed in his messages. This duplicity profoundly affected my mentality because I realized I didn't truly know the person with whom I had shared years of my life. It was as if the man sleeping next to me was a stranger. This feeling of deception made me question everything. Our conversations, our plans, even the happy moments. Had they been real or just part of a show to keep up appearances? I trembled as I read, my hands sweating, my entire body feeling like it was collapsing. And along with the pain came an avalanche of conflicting thoughts. Part of me wanted to scream, to confront, to expose the whole truth right then and there. Another part just wanted to close my eyes, erase everything, pretend I hadn't seen anything. This internal battle was devastating. Between the need to react and the desire to deny, I felt lost, vulnerable, unsure of what to do. And yet, there was something inside me that insisted on seeing that revelation as a turning point. There was no going back, no undoing the discovery. That was the naked truth, and even if it shattered me, I had to deal with it. The impact was so profound that for the first time, I found myself facing the real possibility that my marriage might not survive. This realization paralyzed me. It wasn't just the fear of separation, but the weight of everything that would come with it. The judgment of others, the inquisitive looks in church, the loneliness of facing life without the label of married. It's incredible how, in a single instant, your entire journey can change direction. A bright screen, a few words exchanged, and suddenly, you find yourself in a setting you never wanted to inhabit. I knew that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. And the question that kept nagging at me was, how to move on? How to rebuild something after its foundations have been so brutally ripped away? Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the pain of discovery doesn't end with the initial shock. It multiplies in the choices we're forced to make next. I felt as if the ground had dropped out from under my feet. It was as if the entire structure that had supported my life had crumbled in seconds, leaving only a deep, suffocating void. I repeated to myself, almost in despair, "This can't be real. Not with me. Not with us." It felt like a nightmare from which I would wake at any moment. But the nightmare was real, and it was happening right in my own home. The impact was so strong that even my body reacted. Trembling hands, racing heart, a cold sensation that gripped me from head to toe. It was the kind of shock that leaves no room for reason, only for collapse. In that moment, I realized how a revelation can change not only the story of a relationship, but also the mindset of the recipient. I was certain I knew the man with whom I had shared so many years of my life. I was certain our foundation was solid, that our home was exemplary, and suddenly, all that certainty turned to dust. The betrayal wasn't just his. It was also the narrative I had created about us. The hidden truth was before me, and it was impossible to continue living in illusion. The questions began to torment me. How could he? Since when? How many times? Had I really been deceived all along? And worst of all, had the love I believed existed between us been a lie? These doubts were like sharp knives, cutting through my mind, leaving no room to breathe. The shock of discovery didn't end the moment I read those messages. It extended to every memory, every revisited memory, as if everything had been tainted by betrayal. And in this state of confusion, I realized that the greatest battle wouldn't be just against the pain of what had happened, but against what it was doing to me inside. Because along with the feeling of abandonment, also came a huge weight of failure. I wondered where I had gone wrong, if I hadn't been enough, if I could have done something differently. This kind of thinking is cruel, because it places all the responsibility for the destruction on the betrayed, not on the one who chose to betray. But in shock, the mind doesn't reason fairly. It only seeks explanations, and almost always finds them in unfair blame. It was in this abyss that I realized how the journey I was about to embark on would be deeper than I could have imagined. The pain of betrayal isn't limited to the act itself. It opens doors to insecurities, old fears, and hidden wounds. It's as if a revelation unleashed an avalanche, bringing to the surface everything I never wanted to face. And even as I tried to cling to the faith that had always sustained me, I couldn't find my footing. My heart screamed for answers, and God seemed silent. I looked to the side and saw a man who, until yesterday, had been my companion on this journey, now a stranger in his own home. The shock wasn't just emotional, it was existential. I no longer knew who I was in this relationship. I didn't know what role I still had left to play. The weight of the decisions I would have to make began to sink in, and that frightened me more than anything, because, beyond the pain, I would have to face choices that could forever change the course of my life. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the shock was just the beginning of a transformation that would completely change the way I saw myself, my marriage, and even the faith that sustained my journey. The pain wasn't just that of a betrayed wife, but of a woman who believed her marriage was a gift from God. It was as if a part of me had died along with that discovery. I wept not only for the man who had deceived me, but for the dream I had carried for so many years, for the life I had built, believing it was unbreakable, for the altar before which we had pledged eternal fidelity. This pain was so deep, it seemed to pierce my bones, an unbearable weight in my chest that left me breathless. And the cruelest thing was that it wasn't a visible wound. No one could see how much I was bleeding inside. I had always believed that our marriage had been a gift, a divine calling to live in communion, partnership, and love. And suddenly, that gift seemed to have been ripped from my hands, destroyed by decisions I didn't make, by choices I didn't make. The impact was so great that it began to shake even my faith. I asked myself, if the Lord was with me when I walked down the aisle, why did he allow this to happen now? If he was the one who united us, How is it possible to see the union break in such a cruel way? These questions hammered at me day and night, and every attempt at an answer seemed to sink me deeper into the abyss. The pain of betrayal is complex because it affects not only the heart, but also the mind, the identity, and even the relationship with God. I felt rejected not only as a wife, but as a woman and as a daughter of God. There was a terrible internal conflict. On one side, the conviction that marriage was sacred. On the other, the hidden truth that the person who promised to protect and love me had chosen to betray me. And in the midst of this conflict, I found myself shattered, trying to hold together the threads of a life that no longer existed in the same way. The nights were the worst. I would lie in the bed we'd shared for so many years and feel as if I were lying in ruins. Every corner of the room reminded me of the lie being lived there. It was unbearable to face the reality that this home, which should have been a refuge and shelter, had become a scene of pain. I would cry myself to sleep, and when I woke, it seemed the pain was even more intense, as if each day it found new ways to crush me. It was during this period that I realized how suffering has the power to reveal hidden secrets. Situations I had normalized, behaviors I had justified, now took on new meaning. The journey of a betrayed wife is not just about the loss of a relationship, but about the revelation of a life that, in part, was built on illusions. This realization, though painful, is also transformative, forcing one to look within and face truths previously avoided. And it was precisely at this point that I began to understand that the pain wasn't just breaking me, but also shaping me into something I couldn't yet see. It was as if God was leading me to a new awareness, even if I wasn't clear about it at the time. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the weight of the pain only increased when I realized that, in addition to facing betrayal, I would also have to deal with the judgment of those who, instead of supporting me, chose to point the finger. When the truth came out, I heard things I never imagined I would hear, especially from people I thought capable of embracing me. Cutting phrases like, "You must have failed as a wife," echoed in my ears like invisible stabs. It was as if, besides carrying the weight of betrayal, I also had to shoulder the blame for something I didn't choose. The most painful part wasn't hearing these words from strangers, but from people within the church itself, the place where I had always felt part of a spiritual family. There, where I sought solace, I found judgment. It's curious how, behind the scenes of faith, there's a silent mentality that places the responsibility for keeping the home intact on the woman's shoulders, even if it means ignoring the deepest wounds. Many prefer to believe that if there was infidelity, it was because the wife stopped being attentive, stopped taking care of the house, stopped praying enough. This hidden truth hit me like a whirlwind, because instead of reaching out, they offered me accusations. I was already shattered, but I still had to defend myself against narratives that tried to blame me for my own pain. The impact of this was even more devastating than I expected. I realized I wasn't just fighting my husband's infidelity, but also a belief system that normalizes women's suffering and silences their voices. The journey, already difficult, became even more lonely. I felt like I was in an invisible courtroom, where every look carried a sentence, every comment a new condemnation. And what hurt me even more was realizing that many judged not because they knew the truth, but because they preferred to rely on their own distorted versions of reality. This experience opened my eyes to something I had never seen so clearly before: how the community often fosters unfair standards. It's not enough for a woman to be hurt. She must also prove that she didn't deserve the pain she received. This mentality creates a vicious cycle in which the victim is transformed into the guilty party, and this not only destroys individuals, but also undermines the purpose of a faith that should be synonymous with compassion and acceptance. I remember nights when, besides crying over the betrayal, I cried over the words I heard from the one I most expected support from. It was as if my heart were crushed by an extra layer of pain. Not only had I been deceived by those who promised to love me, but now I was condemned by those who should have sustained me in prayer. This cruel judgment revealed more than the failure of my marriage. It also revealed the fragility of human structures that we often mistake for genuine spirituality. And it was at this point that I realized that my transformation wouldn't come solely from how I dealt with betrayal, but also from the courage to confront these unfair narratives. I needed to question, I needed to bring to light the hidden truths that no one wanted to discuss. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the judgment was just the surface of something bigger, the silencing of my voice and the attempt to erase my pain, as if it didn't matter. Some said, "Pray more and hold on." It was as if my voice had no right to be heard, as if my pain were an insignificant detail compared to the obligation of maintaining an image of a resilient wife. I realized that for many the solution lay in keeping quiet, in enduring, in accepting silence as part of the cross every woman must bear. But this kind of advice doesn't console, it oppresses. It's an extra burden placed on someone who's already fragile, turning the journey of recovery into a prison with no escape. The imposed silence is cruel because it robs a woman of the right to tell her own story. I felt that if I tried to talk about my tears, I would be seen as weak. If I exposed the truth, I would be accused of destroying the family. If I sought support, I would be judged as someone who didn't trust God enough. This mindset left me paralyzed, living between two realities, the public life of a faithful wife and the private life of a broken woman. It's amazing how society, and often the faith community itself, creates backdrops of pain that no one wants to acknowledge. The hidden truth is that this silence doesn't bring healing, it deepens the wounds. Every time I was told to pray more and speak less, I felt my identity being erased. It wasn't just my marriage that was in ruins, it was also my voice, my essence, my right to exist authentically. The impact of this was so great that I began to doubt even my worth as a person. After all, if I couldn't even express what I felt, what was the point of trying to move on? This experience made me realize how so many women go through similar situations, being pushed into a labyrinth of silence. It's as if there's an invisible rule that says, don't expose, don't question, don't complain, just endure. But enduring isn't the same as being strong. Enduring in silence is often a way of slowly dying inside. And it was in this context that my journey began to take on new meaning, because I understood that it wasn't just about surviving betrayal, but also about reclaiming the freedom to speak the truth, to scream when necessary, to refuse to be silenced. This awakening was painful, but transformative. I began to see that every time I agreed to remain silent, I reinforced an unjust structure that imprisons so many other women. The decision to allow myself to speak, to break this cycle, was one of the most difficult I've ever made, because it involved facing stares, judgments, and even losing some bonds I believed were unshakable. But at the same time, it was liberating because it gave me back something that betrayal and silence had tried to steal, the awareness that my voice has value. And this is precisely where the transformation begins, not just in the marriage that fell apart, but in the mindset I needed to rebuild. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after the silence came loneliness, and this was one of the most defining phases of my journey. I cried alone, feeling like not even God could hear me anymore. The pillow knew all my tears, and each night seemed longer than the last. The silence of the house echoed within me like a cruel reminder that I no longer had company, no presence, not even a shoulder to turn to. The loneliness became almost palpable, a constant weight on my shoulders, making me doubt everything I believed in. I stared at the ceiling in the darkness and wondered if God was still there, if He truly saw what I was going through, or if He had left me to deal with this emptiness alone. The prayers that once flowed naturally were now just shaky whispers, interrupted by sobs. Often I couldn't even find the words. I just cried, believing that perhaps crying was a form of prayer that He would understand. But the human heart is fragile, and the mind insists on seeking explanations. Mine told me that I was forgetful, that perhaps my faith wasn't as strong as I imagined. With each dawn, I felt more distant from the presence that had always accompanied me. The impact of this was devastating, because it wasn't just the loss of a marriage, it was also the feeling of losing my connection with the divine. This journey of endless nights showed me a hidden truth. Loneliness isn't just about being without someone by your side, but also about feeling like no one understands the intensity of the pain you carry. I would get up in the morning, wash my face, put on a forced smile, and go about my day as if I were whole, while inside, I was in pieces. The contrast between my public image and my private suffering consumed me. It was like living in two worlds. On stage, a seemingly strong woman; backstage, an exhausted and broken soul. And it was in this cycle of tears and silence that I began to realize how solitude can transform a person's mindset. It reveals weaknesses, yes, but it also exposes the need to make choices. I could give in to complete despair, or I could somehow use that desert as a space for revelation. This realization didn't come immediately, but it crept in between the breaks in my crying. It was as if, amidst the darkness, a tiny spark tried to insist that there was still something beyond that pain. Those nights were a turning point. They taught me to face myself, to face the weight of loneliness without running away, to recognize that behind all that suffering lay an opportunity for transformation. But at that time, I still couldn't see it clearly. I simply survived, one day at a time, hoping the next dawn would bring some relief. And perhaps that's the greatest impact of loneliness. It brings us face to face with what's deepest within us, forcing us to deal with feelings we've always avoided. And it was precisely in this place of emptiness that I realized my faith hadn't completely disappeared, but was being tested in a way I'd never experienced before. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after the loneliness came something even more painful, a crisis of faith that almost made me give up everything I'd ever believed in. I even closed my Bible for weeks. I would look at it on the shelf and feel a weight on my chest, as if those pages that once brought me comfort had lost their ability to speak to me. I would say softly, often between sobs, "Lord, if you exist, why did you allow this?" This question echoed like an unanswered cry. It was as if faith, which had always been my refuge, had become a barren territory, incapable of welcoming me. I, who had so often encouraged others to trust, now found myself unable to believe. This spiritual crisis was deeper than the betrayal itself, because when you lose a marriage, you can still rebuild with human support. But when your relationship with God seems broken, you feel like you have nowhere left to turn. The impact was so devastating that I began to think my prayer life had been in vain. I wondered if God truly heard every plea I'd made over the years, if He was with me when I knelt asking for protection for my home, or if it was all just an echo in the void. This hidden truth in my heart frightened me. I was considering giving up on the one who had always been my foundation. It's hard to explain, but the feeling was one of abandonment. I felt like a child left alone in a dark place, searching for a hand that never came. Every time someone told me, "Keep going, God is in control," instead of comfort, I felt anger. How could He be in control if I was living in chaos? This mindset gnawed at me because it seemed to contradict everything I'd learned since childhood. I, who had talked so much about unshakable faith, was faced with the revelation that my faith was far more fragile than I'd imagined. And it was at this point that spiritual loneliness joined emotional loneliness. It was no longer just my husband's absence or people's judgment. It was divine silence that tormented me. The nights became even longer, and the days felt meaningless. I dragged myself through the routine, fulfilling my obligations, but I felt the flame within me fading. My journey seemed to have reached a dead end. Still, even amidst the darkness, there were moments when something very small made me think that perhaps I wasn't entirely alone. A song that suddenly appeared, a word spoken by someone unaware of my plight, a verse that came to mind even when I tried to push it away. They were like brief flashes, but they reminded me that there was something beyond my pain. Yet these signs weren't enough to pull me out of the crisis. I saw them, but I couldn't hold on to them firmly. This phase was marked by unanswered questions and internal decisions I didn't want to make. Between giving up completely or trying to keep going, I vacillated like someone adrift in a boat, directionless. And it was in this space of doubt that I realized that true transformation doesn't happen in the calm, but in the storm. Because it's when everything seems to fall apart that we are confronted with who we truly are and the faith we truly carry. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, Because after the spiritual crisis came rock bottom, where I discovered that losing everything wasn't the end, but the beginning of a new way of seeing life. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself. It was as if the reflection was no longer mine, as if that woman with the empty gaze had lost everything that defined her. I was no longer beautiful. I was simply the betrayed wife. This painful identity took hold of me so intensely that it seemed impossible to escape it. Every thought, every gesture, every memory was imbued with this mark. It was like carrying an invisible label that no one needed to say out loud, because I already felt it stamped on my skin. My lowest point wasn't just the betrayal itself, but the way I let it define me. I could no longer see my achievements, my story, my faith, nothing beyond that open wound. It was as if my entire life had been reduced to a single event, and the deeper I immersed myself in this mindset, the further I became from the woman I once was. My energy vanished, my will to live vanished, and even the small pleasures that once brought me joy no longer held any meaning. This phase was marked by profound exhaustion, not just physical, but also spiritual. I got up every day because I had to, but it was as if I were on automatic, just fulfilling obligations without truly existing. At rock bottom, even the colors of the world seemed to lose their intensity. People chatted around me, but it was as if I no longer belonged there. I was trapped in a kind of dark backstage, invisible to anyone looking in from the outside. The scariest thing is how this state of internal destruction can lead us to dangerous decisions. I even questioned whether there was any point in continuing. The feeling of uselessness, failure, and abandonment was so strong that the idea of giving up seemed easier than facing it. Few people talk about this, but the hidden truth is that many women, when they reach this point, consider simply ceasing to exist, believing that nothing they do will change their reality. It's a consuming emptiness that saps our strength, making us believe we are nothing more than the pain we feel. Yet, amidst all this, there was a part of me that held on, however small, a flame that had almost died out but insisted on staying lit. Maybe it was faith, maybe it was survival instinct, maybe it was simply the memory that, somewhere, there was a version of me that wasn't defined by betrayal. I couldn't access it at that moment, but I knew that if I didn't hold on to that spark, I would lose myself completely. This awareness, however fragile, was what kept me from giving up completely. I was at rock bottom, but something inside me told me there was still a way out, even if I couldn't see it clearly. And that was when a new phase of my journey began, not because I was healed or strong, but because I realized I no longer wanted to be just a reflection of pain. I needed to rediscover who I was, even if it meant starting from scratch. This was the first true revelation that transformation only happens when we recognize the depth of our fall, and it was with this recognition that something unexpected began to happen. Still hurt, still confused, I began to notice small signs of hope. They weren't major changes, but subtle movements that showed me that perhaps my story wasn't over. A kind word, a fond memory that surfaced, a timid prayer that managed to escape through tears. These details felt like seeds sown in the desert, and even without understanding, I began to believe they could blossom. That was the moment I understood that rock bottom, however painful, can also be the place where the courage to rebuild is born. The pain was still there, but now I saw that it wasn't the end, just a critical point in my journey. And it was at that point that I decided to look ahead with different eyes, even if still clouded by tears. I didn't know what awaited me, but I knew I couldn't stay there forever. And that decision, however small, was the first step toward something greater. It was precisely at that point that my journey began to take on new meaning, because at the moment I almost gave up, a new opportunity began to emerge. And when I realized that spark inside me still insisted on shining, even at rock bottom, I understood that perhaps I wasn't as alone as I thought. Every detail, no matter how small, showed me that there was a greater purpose hidden behind so much pain. And sharing this with you is also part of this journey, because I know many women go through similar situations and need to hear that there is hope, even when all seems lost. And that's why I want to open my heart and ask for something special. If this topic resonates with you, if my story has touched your life in some way, Please like this video. It may seem like a simple gesture, but it's precisely this participation that makes the channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content. Each like is like a seed that spreads and helps this message reach other women who, like me, have cried in the silence of the night, believing they were alone. Your participation here not only strengthens me to continue, but also creates a chain of support and empathy that can transform many lives. Leave a comment below with what has touched you most so far, because your words could be the answer another woman needs. And as I continue to share each step of this journey, I want you to feel like you're part of this story with me, because together we can give new meaning to our pain. Because after hitting rock bottom, I discovered there was still something greater waiting for me, and this revelation began to change everything inside me. Until a friend of faith said something to me that pierced my heart like a ray of light in the darkness. Linda, your worth doesn't come from what he did to you, but from what Christ did for you. In that moment, I felt as if a breach had opened in the wall of pain I had built around myself. It was just a sentence, but it brought with it a revelation I hadn't yet been able to grasp. I was allowing betrayal to define who I was, when, in fact, my identity had already been established long before in something much greater and more solid than the error of one human being. That phrase echoed within me for days. I repeated it mentally, almost like a mantra, and each time I did, something inside me reorganized. It was as if I were being reminded that my story hadn't ended at that rock bottom. The transformation didn't happen immediately, but that breath of hope was the first step toward me starting to lift my eyes again. For the first time in a long time, I was able to consider the possibility that there was something beyond the pain, that my fate wasn't limited to the label of betrayed wife. This awakening also brought a shift in mindset. I began to realize that no matter how much I had lost, there was still so much within me that could be reclaimed. The joy, the strength, the courage, all of it seemed dormant, but not dead. The impact of this small seed of hope was so great that it transformed the way I viewed my decisions from then on. I could continue living as a victim, or I could, little by little, choose to live as someone who survived and found new meaning in their journey. Of course, it wasn't simple. The pain didn't disappear, nor did the emptiness cease to exist overnight. But now there was a counterpoint, a different voice telling me that I didn't need to limit myself to what happened to me. It was like walking among ruins, and suddenly spotting a small flower blooming among the stones. Small, delicate, but enough to show me that life was still possible. This revelation made me understand that sometimes God uses the people around us to remind us of truths we forget when we're blinded by grief. This friend didn't bring a magic solution, but she did bring something even more powerful, the reminder that my worth could never be measured by another person's mistakes. And it was from this realization that I began to see that perhaps betrayal wasn't the end of my story, but merely a comma in a much larger narrative. It was a breath of hope that not only soothed my heart, but also rekindled my faith, still fragile, but willing to rebuild. And as this new perspective took hold within me, I realized that the healing journey wouldn't be about forgetting what happened, but about transforming pain into learning and loss into purpose. Those words made me bend my knees again, even though I was weak, even through tears. At first, it was almost a mechanical gesture, like someone trying to hold on to something they can't feel. But no was once real. I had no beautiful speeches, no long prayers, just moans, short, confused sentences, often accompanied by more tears than words. But still, there, in the silence of my room, something began to move inside me. It was as if, by getting back on my knees, I was saying, "Lord, I don't know how, but I still want to believe." This return wasn't magical or instantaneous. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but a slow process made up of small decisions. Each time I bent my knees, even without feeling anything, it was like planting an invisible seed. Little by little, I realized that this discipline, this almost desperate surrender, was rebuilding me from within. I no longer spoke to God with the same confidence as before, but with raw sincerity, without masks, without trying to appear strong. It was at that moment that I understood that He didn't need my rehearsed words, but my vulnerability. And it was precisely in this vulnerability that I found a new space for revelation. When I stopped trying to maintain the image of a woman of unshakable faith and presented myself as I truly was, broken, tired, without answers, I realized that God hadn't withdrawn. On the contrary, it was in this place of weakness that I began to feel glimpses of peace that didn't come from within. The impact of this was profound, because it showed me that prayer wasn't about convincing God to change the situation, but about allowing Him to change me in the midst of it. There were still nights when I felt alone, when it seemed like my words were hitting the ceiling and bouncing back. But every now and then, a verse would come to mind. A song would play on the radio at just the right time. A memory of something He had already done for me would surface as an answer. These details were small breaths that kept me going, and I realized that each prayer, however fragile, was becoming part of a new journey of transformation, of rebuilding, of hope. The most striking thing was realizing that I didn't need to have all my strength to approach God. I could come just as I was, broken, imperfect, exhausted, and He would still receive me. This hidden truth, which I had never experienced so truly, began to redefine my mindset. I didn't need to carry the guilt of not being enough, because there was already someone who was enough for me. This revelation changed the way I viewed my own prayers, and it was at that point that I understood that bending my knees again wasn't a sign of weakness, but of courage, because recognizing that I couldn't handle the pain alone was the first step toward letting something greater work within me. This decision, however simple, marked the beginning of a new chapter in my story, and it was precisely in this chapter that I discovered that prayer not only reconnected me with God, but also began to reconnect me with myself. From that moment on, something within me began to blossom again, even through tears, and this was one of the greatest revelations of my journey. I began to understand that my faith didn't depend on what my husband did, but on what Christ had already done for me. This revelation was like a key that opened doors I hadn't even known were locked inside me. I had let the betrayal define my worth, let his mistake shape my identity. But little by little I realized it wasn't fair to live imprisoned by a label that didn't belong to me. The betrayal was part of my story, yes, but it wasn't my whole story. It was at that moment that I began to see the difference between carrying a wound and allowing it to become my identity. This transformation didn't happen with a snap of my fingers. It was a process. With every prayer, with every sincere conversation with God, I understood that He had already declared who I was. Beloved, chosen, a daughter. And no human decision had the power to erase that truth. It was difficult to change my mindset because for a long time I saw myself only as the betrayed wife, but I began to realize there was much more to me than this pain. It was as if I were digging through the rubble of my life and suddenly finding a treasure that had always been there, but which I had never noticed. The impact of this reconnection with myself was immense. I looked in the mirror again, and instead of seeing only emptiness in my eyes, I began to find traces of courage, strength, and resilience. I discovered that the pain hadn't destroyed me, but had revealed layers of myself that had been hidden. This was one of the greatest revelations of my journey, understanding that true identity isn't shaped by what we've lost, but by who we are at our core. Of course, there were still days of relapse, moments when memories would come back and make me question whether I was truly moving forward. But the difference was that now I had a different foundation. Instead of leaning on a marriage that had collapsed, I was leaning on a rock that couldn't be shaken. This decision to shift the focus of my identity was crucial to moving forward. And it was precisely at that point that I began to see life differently. Betrayal, however cruel, didn't have to be my eternal prison. It could be the door to a new chapter, one of transformation and purpose. I began to understand that when we choose to rebuild our identity based on that which is eternal, no circumstance has the power to define us completely. This process wasn't just spiritual, it was also emotional and practical. I began to care for myself in ways I'd previously neglected. Small decisions, like resuming activities that brought me pleasure, reconnecting with true friends, and even learning to enjoy my own company, were important steps in reclaiming the woman I was and discovering the woman I could still become. Rebuilding my identity was like putting together puzzle pieces. Some were broken, others were missing, But I realized I didn't need them all to start over. Life doesn't have to be complete for us to move forward. It's enough to be clear about who we are deep down. And that's what gave me the strength to continue the journey, now with a renewed perspective. This rediscovery of myself was what finally showed me that I wasn't defined by betrayal, but by the truth Christ had declared about me from the beginning. And it was at that moment that I realized that the pain, though devastating, had led me to a revelation that would completely transform the course of my life. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after rebuilding my identity, I had to face one of the greatest challenges: learning to forgive without losing my own essence. Little by little, I realized I wasn't alone. The Lord never abandoned me, even when I doubted, even when I closed the Bible and said I no longer wanted to speak to Him. It was in this contrast between my rejection and His constancy that I began to see a truth that completely transformed my mindset. God's faithfulness doesn't depend on mine. I can fail, I can falter, I can feel at rock bottom, but He remains. This revelation began to dissolve, little by little, the fear I carried within me, the fear of being alone, the fear of never being loved again, the fear of not being enough. This process of overcoming was not linear. There were days when I seemed to advance miles and others when I fell back all over again. But the difference was that now I realized I didn't have to fight alone. I remembered the late nights when I cried myself to sleep and understood that, even in the silence, God was there, holding pieces of my heart that I could no longer hold. This realization had a direct impact on my decisions. I no longer made choices driven by the fear of being abandoned again, but began to see that my life could be built on solid foundations, without depending on the approval or presence of someone who chose to hurt me. It was on this journey that I understood how the fear of abandonment so deeply shapes the way we live. It makes us accept less than we deserve, keeps us silent when we should speak, keeps us in places that no longer belong. I saw, behind the scenes of my own story, how this fear had trapped me in a relationship that was already falling apart. And when I finally recognized this, I felt there was a special power in freeing myself. Human abandonment hurt deeply, but the divine presence showed me that I was never truly alone. This shift in mindset was the beginning of a true transformation. I began to see myself differently, no longer as a discarded woman, but as someone who had been rescued. And this revelation brought a new freedom, the freedom to walk without chains, without having to define myself by what I had lost, but by what I could still build. The impact of this was so powerful that I began to believe that even the most broken parts of my story could be used for something greater. Of course, fear still crept in from time to time, but now I had an antidote, the certainty that God's love is constant even when everything around me falls apart. This gave me the courage to stand up, to hold my head high, to no longer accept living as a victim. It was a process of rediscovering myself, and at the same time, a spiritual awakening that brought peace amidst uncertainty. And it's here that I realize how much this journey of grief has taken me to places I never imagined. Because overcoming the fear of abandonment wasn't just about the past, but about making room for a whole new future. A future where I could choose to no longer be defined by what happened to me, but by who I decided to become from then on. This was the greatest revelation. It doesn't matter who left me, because the one who never abandons me is enough to sustain me in any circumstance. This awareness began to prepare me for the next step in my story, a step that would require even more courage, learning to forgive not only those who hurt me, but also myself, for having so often believed that I was not worthy of being loved. If you've also been betrayed, abandoned, or judged, know this: your life isn't over. This pain, which now seems unbearable, doesn't define who you are or determine your future. I know it's hard to believe this when everything around you seems to be falling apart, but there is a God who sees every tear, who knows the behind the scenes of your story, and who continues to write chapters you can't yet see. The impact of betrayal is profound. It touches our identity, shakes our certainties, and tries to erase our hope. But there is a hidden truth that changes everything. You are not what happened to you. You are what Christ has already declared about your life. This journey has shown me that even at rock bottom, there is the possibility of transformation. It's at the moment we think there's no way out that He surprises us with new revelations, reminding us that we are loved, chosen, and capable of starting over. So, if you feel alone today, remember that you're not. God still has plans for you, plans greater than any pain you've ever experienced, and He can transform scars into powerful testimonies. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment, share this video with other women who need to hear this message, and subscribe to the channel to continue receiving stories of faith and overcoming. Because together, by sharing our stories, we become